Welcome to Show Hell. I'm here to help you relax tonight. I know many of you use this video to fall asleep. So before you get too warm, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there now. Relax, take a deep breath, and let yourself unwind. The following story: Caroline's face went white. The accident: you swerved to avoid a truck on the interstate. You've been unconscious for 3 days. She spoke rapidly, as if speed might force recognition. We have 3 children: Penelope, Christopher, Edmund. We live on Commerce Street. You own the bookshop downtown. Hugh felt nothing. No memory stirred. No emotional connection sparked. The bookshop, though, that resonated faintly, like an echo from a distant room. "I'll get the doctor," Carolyn said, rising abruptly. Her movement seemed unnecessarily precise, controlled. Alone, Hugh tried to inventory what he remembered. His bookshop, certainly. Farrington's rare books, with its narrow aisles and the smell of old leather. His apartment above it, sparse but comfortable. Eating meals alone, reading late into the night. The contentment of solitude, but a wife, children. 12 years of marriage, as Caroline claimed nothing. When she returned with Dr. Peton, Hugh submitted to the usual neurological tests. The diagnosis was predictable: retrograde amnesia following severe concussion, personal memories affected, general knowledge intact, recovery likely but uncertain. Your family will help, Dr. Peton assured him. Familiar faces, familiar routines. These often act as catalysts. The children arrived next. 3 small strangers who called him Daddy, with voices tight with worry. Christopher, 11, with Hugh's own gray eyes. Penelope, 8, hanging back by the door. Edmund, 4, clutching a stuffed rabbit. "Hello," he said, feeling like an actor who'd forgotten his lines. They stayed briefly, their presence filling the room with expectant energy that you couldn't match. After they left, he lay in the growing darkness, wondering why a man would forget his children's faces, but remember every book in his shop's inventory. That night, Hugh woke to find a slip of paper under his pillow. Block letters carefully printed. "They aren't yours. Don't let them tuck you in." His heart hammered against his ribs. Who could have left this? Hospital security was tight. The nurses all knew Caroline, and the children spoke warmly of the devoted family that barely left his side. Yet here was this warning placed where only he would find it. Hugh hid the note and tried to sleep, but questions multiplied in the darkness. If Caroline was truly his wife, why did her touch feel wrong? If these were his children, why did he feel nothing when they looked at him with such obvious need? Morning brought discharge papers and Caroline's announcement that everything was ready for his homecoming. She drove him through Natch streets he recognized to a white Victorian house with green shutters that felt like a stranger's home. Inside, Caroline had prepared everything perfectly, too perfectly. His study was exactly as she claimed he'd left it, down to the orange cat named Mr. Whiskers, sleeping in the leather chair. But nothing felt familiar, despite overwhelming evidence that this was his life. In the desk drawer, Hugh found photographs. His wedding to Caroline, holding babies, family Christmas mornings. The images were authentic. Definitely him. Definitely her. Definitely a life lived together. But they felt like someone else's memories borrowed rather than owned. That evening, 3 days into his supposed recovery, Hugh excused himself and walked to his bookshop. The key on Caroline's ring worked perfectly. Inside, everything was as he remembered. The narrow aisles, the careful organization, the satisfaction of books properly cared for. But when he climbed the stairs to what Caroline claimed was a long-sold apartment, he found something impossible. His current home, rumpled sheets, coffee cups in the sink, clothes in the closet, a lease agreement dated 6 months ago. This was where he lived. This was real. Hidden under the bed was a shoebox containing documents that made his blood freeze. Marriage certificate dated 6 months ago, not 12 years. Birth certificates for the children dated even more recently, some only 3 months old. Everything Caroline had told him was a lie. Footsteps on the shop floor below interrupted his discovery. Voices, Caroline sharp with worry, and another he recognized as his assistant Bertram. Told you he was asking questions. He didn't think he would remember if he finds the apartment. Hugh climbed out the fire escape window, his mind reeling. Bertram, who he'd trusted, was part of whatever deception surrounded him. But deception toward what end? Why create an elaborate false family? Walking aimlessly through Natchez as Hugh tried to process the impossible. If his marriage was recent, not 12-year-old, then what about the children? How do you create 3 children with complete personalities and memories overnight? Unless the thought hit him like a physical blow. Unless they weren't his children at all. Unless they belonged to someone else. The real Hugh Farrington, whose life had been stolen. And if that was true, where was the real Hugh Farrington now? The answer came with horrible clarity. Exactly where everyone expected him to be. But in a place where his protests would be dismissed as delusions. Hugh walked to the Natchez State Hospital with growing certainty. If there really was another Hugh Farrington, that's where he'd be, in the psychiatric ward, claiming his identity had been stolen, insisting his family was missing. Getting inside required careful timing. But Hugh managed to slip through a side entrance behind a staff member. The psychiatric ward was on the 3rd floor. The nurse at the desk confirmed what Hugh hoped and dreaded to find. Hugh Farrington, room 312. Poor man thinks people have stolen his identity, kidnapped his family. Complete break with reality. Room 312 contained a man who looked exactly like Hugh Farrington. Not similar, identical. Same face, same scar on the chin, same everything. The other Hugh looked up as Hugh entered, and their eyes met. "You," the other Hugh said quietly. "You're me?" "Yes." "Then you know what they've done." Hugh closed the door behind him. "Tell me." "They took everything. My wife, my children, my life. Caroline, Christopher, Penelope, Edmund, they were mine. Really mine. We were happy." The other Hugh's voice broke. "I woke up here 3 months ago, and they said I was delusional. But I know what's real. I've been living with them. You said they think I'm their father. Of course they do. That's how she makes it work. How is it possible? 2 identical people." Before the other Hugh could answer, the door opened. Caroline entered, followed by Dr. Whitfield. The ward psychiatrist. There you are, Caroline said, her mask of concern slipping. Hill, you're not well. This delusion about having a double. Which one of us are you talking to? Hugh asked, looking between Caroline and the broken man on the bed. Caroline moved toward Hugh, but he stepped away. How did you do it? How did you split one person into two? You're confused, Caroline said, but panic flickered in her eyes. Had injuries can cause. I found the documents. Marriage certificate 6 months ago, not 12 years. Recent birth certificates for the children. Everything you told me was a lie. The other Hugh sat up straighter. The children's birth certificates are recent. Very recent. Horror dawned in the other Hugh's eyes. They're not birth certificates. They're adoption papers. She didn't just steal me. She replaced my children with different ones. The room fell silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights. Where are they? Hugh demanded. Where are his real wife and children? Caroline's composure finally cracked completely. Instead of fleeing, she stepped back into the room and closed the door. You want the truth. Her voice had changed, become something cold and alien. Fine. She looked between the two Hugh Farringtons with something that might have been regret. Neither of you is the real Hugh Farrington. He died in that car accident 3 months ago. What you are, both of you are echoes, fragments of a consciousness that couldn't let go. The words hit like physical blows. Hugh felt reality shift beneath him. That's impossible, he said. Is it? You both wondered how two identical people could exist. You both puzzled over memories that don't fit, emotions that won't connect. You're fragments of a dead man's psyche. The other you sank back on the bed. My children were never yours. They're orphans. I'm caring for 3 children who needed a home. Caroline's voice softened slightly. I thought I could give them a father. I thought the echo of Hugh Farrington could love them. But I remember, the other Hugh whispered. You remember what Hugh would have remembered if he'd lived to have children. Your ghosts haunting a life that might have been. Hugh felt his certainties dissolving. Why create us at all? Because I loved him. Hugh Farrington was special. When he died, I couldn't accept it. So, I found a way to bring back part of him. How does it matter? Love, desperation, refusal to accept ending. I wanted to undo death itself. Hugh looked at his other self and saw his own future. Gradual dissolution. Slow unraveling of borrowed consciousness. The note in the hospital. The part of Hugh that fought back. Even fragmented. He was trying to protect himself from the lie I'd created. Hugh felt the first waves of dissolution beginning. Edges of consciousness loosening. What happens now? Now you choose. Continue pretending or accept what you are and find peace in letting go. The children, what happens to them? They'll be cared for. They'll find their way to real lives, not fantasies. The other spoke weakly. Tell them the man who pretended to be their father loved them as much as a ghost can love. Caroline nodded, tears starting. I will. Hugh felt himself become entranced, insubstantial. The room grew less solid, edges blurred. Thank you, he said to Caroline. meaning it despite everything. You gave us existence we wouldn't have had otherwise. I am sorry, she whispered. Don't be. Take care of them. Live the life we couldn't. The other Hugh was fading too, but his eyes remained fixed on Carolyn with forgiveness. Take care of them, he echoed. All of them. And then they were gone, dissolved back into whatever void had given them temporary form, leaving only the impression of two men who had briefly loved a family that was never quite their own. Caroline stood alone with Dr. Whitfield staring at empty space. What did I just witness? The doctor whispered. The end of a story that should never have been written, and the beginning of whatever comes next. She turned toward the corridor, toward 3 children who would wake tomorrow to find their temporary father had vanished like a dream. There would be questions and grief, but also truth finally. Behind her, the room settled into emptiness, holding only lingering warmth. Where 2 impossible men had briefly existed, loved him perfectly, and chosen how their stories would end. The Mississippi River continued its eternal flow past Natchez, carrying away remnants of one story while preparing to witness countless others. In the distance, a bookshop stood empty, waiting for someone new to discover the treasures hidden among its shelves. Every image, Hugh appeared relaxed, happy, genuinely connected to these people who now felt like strangers to him. The photographs disturbed him more than anything else had. They were not simply evidence of his marriage and fatherhood. They were evidence of his emotional investment in these relationships. The man in these pictures loved his wife and children. That much was clear from his expression, his body language, the way he held them close to his side. But if that man was truly him, then where had those feelings gone? How could love simply vanish, leaving no trace behind? Hugh was so absorbed in the photographs that he didn't hear the soft footsteps in the hallway, only when a small voice said, "Daddy." Did he look up to find Edmund standing in the doorway, clutching a stuffed rabbit? "Hello, Edmund," Hugh said, carefully replacing the photographs in the drawer. "Mommy says you're sick," Edmund said, approaching with the fearless curiosity of a 4-year-old. "But you look the same." "I am the same," Hugh said, though he wasn't certain this was true. "I just can't remember some things right now." "Like what?" Like your birthday party when you turned 4. Edmund brightened. "It was at the park. We had a pirate cake, and you wore the hat with the feather, and you made all the other daddies walk the plank off the picnic table." Hugh tried to picture this scene himself, in a pirate hat, entertaining children at a birthday party, but the image remained stubbornly elusive. "That sounds like fun," he said. "It was the best party ever," Edmund said solemnly. "Even better than Christopher's party last year when the magician made the rabbit disappear and it never came back. What happened to the rabbit? Christopher thinks it went to rabbit heaven, but Penelope says it probably just ran away because it was scared of the magic words. I think maybe it's still hiding somewhere, waiting for the right person to find it." There was something in the child's matter-of-fact acceptance of mystery that resonated with Hugh's current situation. Perhaps he too was like that rabbit, not gone exactly, but hiding, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge from whatever dark place he had retreated to. Edmund, Caroline's voice called from somewhere deeper in the house. "Where are you, sweetheart?" "I'm talking to Daddy," Edmund called back. "Well, don't tire him out. He needs his rest." Edmund leaned closer to Hugh, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Are you going to get better soon?" "I don't know," he admitted. "I hope so." "Me too," Edmund said. "It's not the same when you're not really you." The child's observation was so perceptive that Hugh felt a chill run down his spine. "You're not really you." Was that what was happening?
Was he becoming someone else?
Or was someone else becoming him? That evening, the family gathered in the dining room for what Caroline announced was Hugh's favorite meal: roast chicken with rosemary, mashed potatoes, and green beans from their own garden. The food was expertly prepared and undeniably delicious, but he found himself wondering how Caroline could be so certain of his preferences when he himself was not. The conversation was carefully orchestrated, with Caroline steering the discussion towards safe topics and the children contributing observations about school and friends and neighborhood happenings. Hugh participated as best he could, but he felt like an actor in a play for which he had not been given a script. "Mrs. Hartwell from next door asked about you," Carolyn said as she served dessert. A peach cobbler that she claimed was made from his mother's recipe. "She wanted to know when you'd be well enough for visitors." "What did you tell her?" "That you were recovering well, but needed time to rest." "She understood, of course. She's been through her own health struggles." Hugh nodded. Though he had no idea who Mrs. Hartwell was, or what her health struggles might have been. The entire neighborhood apparently was populated with people who knew him better than he knew himself. After dinner, Caroline supervised the children's baths and bedtime routines, while Hugh retreated to his study. The guest room she had prepared for him was comfortable enough, but he found himself drawn to the space that felt, if not familiar, then at least authentically his own. He was examining the books on his shelves, a collection that reflected his professional interests, but also revealed personal tastes he could not remember developing when he heard a soft knock at the door. "Come in," he called, expecting to see Carolyn. Instead, it was Christopher who entered, already in his pajamas, his dark hair damp from his bath. "I wanted to say good night," the boy said, hovering near the door with the same weariness his siblings had shown. "Good night, Christopher," Hugh said. "Sleep well." The boy didn't leave immediately. Instead, he studied Hugh's face with those serious gray eyes that were so disconcertingly like his own. "You really don't remember anything about us, do you?" Christopher asked. Hugh considered lying, offering some reassurance that might ease the child's obvious distress. But something in Christopher's expression suggested he would see through any deception. "No," Hugh said quietly. "I'm sorry, but I don't." Christopher nodded, as if this confirmed something he had already suspected. "The night before your accident, you came to my room to say goodnight. You told me you were going to Jackson to look at some old books, and that you'd bring me back something special. Do you remember what you promised to bring me?" Hugh felt the familiar frustration of reaching for a memory that simply wasn't there. I'm sorry, Christopher. I don't remember. A compass, Christopher said. An old brass compass from a ship. You said every explorer needs a good compass to find his way home. The irony of the gift was not lost on you. Here he was, more lost than any explorer, without even the most basic compass to guide him back to his own life. I'm sure when I'm feeling better, we can find you that compass, Hugh said. Maybe, Christopher said, but his tone suggested he was not optimistic about Hugh's recovery. Good night, Daddy. After the boy left, Hugh sat in the leather chair recently vacated by Mr. Whiskers and tried to process the day's events. The house, the photographs, the children's matter-of-fact acceptance of him as their father. All of it suggested that he was indeed Hugh Farrington, husband and father, a man who had somehow lost 12 years of his life to a head injury. But the note hidden in his hospital drawer suggested otherwise. They aren't yours. Don't let them tuck you in. As if summoned by his thoughts, Caroline appeared in the doorway, wearing a flowered robe and carrying a small tray. I thought you might like some tea before bed, she said. Chamomile to help you sleep. She set the tray on his desk and poured the tea with practiced efficiency. The steam rose fragrant and soothing, and you found himself grateful for the gesture even as he wondered about its motivation. Are you comfortable in the guest room? Caroline asked. I put fresh sheets on the bed, and there are extra blankets in the closet if you get cold. Thank you. You've been very kind. Caroline's smile was soft, tinged with sadness. You don't have to thank me, Hugh. I'm your wife. Taking care of you is what I do. She moved closer, and for a moment, Hugh thought she might kiss him good night. Instead, she reached out and straightened his collar, her fingers lingering briefly against his neck. Don't let them tuck you in. The note had warned. Was this what it meant? This gentle, whiffly attention that felt somehow invasive, possessive. Sleep well, Caroline said, her hand trailing briefly across his shoulder before she turned to leave. Tomorrow will be a better day. You'll see. After she left, Hugh stared at the cup of tea without drinking it. The liquid was pale gold, innocuous looking, but he found himself reluctant to consume anything Caroline had prepared. The paranoia felt foolish, but he could not shake the memory of the note's urgent warning. Instead of drinking the tea, he carried the cup to the guest room Caroline had prepared for him. The room was pleasant enough, decorated in muted blues and greens, with a four-poster bed that looked both comfortable and somehow confining. Hugh set the teacup on the bedside table and examined the room more carefully. The closet contained clothes that were apparently his, shirts and trousers in his size, shoes that showed the wear patterns of his feet. But like everything else in this house, they felt like costumes, garments chosen for him by someone else to help him play a role he didn't remember accepting. He undressed carefully, favoring his injured ribs, and climbed into the unfamiliar bed. The sheets smelled of lavender and starch, clean and domestic. But as he lay in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the house settling around him, Hugh found himself thinking about his apartment above the bookshop. In his memory, it was sparse, almost monastic, but it was undeniably his own space. No one else's possessions cluttered the rooms. No one else's preferences shaped the arrangement of furniture or the choice of colors. Sleep, when it came, brought dreams of corridors and doorways, of voices calling his name from rooms he could never quite reach. He dreamed of Carolyn's hands adjusting his blankets, of children's faces watching him from the shadows, of a note written in block letters that grew larger and larger until the words filled his entire field of vision. They aren't yours. He woke in the gray light of dawn to find his sheets soaked with perspiration and his heart racing with unnamed fear. The house was quiet around him, but he could sense the presence of other people beyond his door. The family that claimed him, that insisted he belonged to them as much as they belonged to him. Hugh rose and dressed quietly, then slipped out of the guest room and through the house to the back door. The garden was larger than it had appeared from the street, with carefully tended beds of flowers and vegetables, a wooden swing hanging from the branches of an old oak tree, and a small shed that presumably contained gardening tools. In the early morning light, the domesticity of the scene should have been comforting. This was the life he had supposedly built, the home he had chosen, the family he had cherished. But instead of comfort, Hugh felt only a growing sense of wrongness, as if he were an intruder in someone else's paradise. He walked to the gate at the back of the garden and found it unlocked. Beyond lay an alley that ran between the houses on Commerce Street and the parallel avenue behind it. Hugh had no destination in mind, but he found himself walking toward the historic district, toward the river, toward the bookshop that was the one place in this strange new world that felt authentically his own. The streets were empty at this early hour, populated only by the occasional jogger or dog walker. Hugh moved carefully, favoring his injured ribs, but with a sense of purpose that had been absent since his awakening in the hospital. Whatever was happening to him, whatever elaborate deception or genuine medical condition had stolen his memory, he needed to find answers. And those answers, he felt certain, lay not in the perfect domestic tableau of Commerce Street, but in the life he could actually remember. Bertram was already at the shop when Hugh arrived, unlocking the front door with the careful precision of someone who had performed this ritual countless times. He was older than Hugh had expected, perhaps 70, with silver hair and wire-rimmed spectacles that gave him the appearance of a scholarly librarian. Mr. Farrington Bertram's face lit up with genuine pleasure and relief. "My dear fellow, how wonderful to see you up and about. I've been so worried since Mrs. Farrington called about the accident." "Hello, Bertram," Hugh said, and was pleased to find that the name felt natural on his tongue. The first thing in days that it felt entirely right. Come in," Bertram fussed, ushering Hugh into the shop. "You shouldn't be out so early, surely, and in your condition." "I needed to see the shop," Hugh said, "to see if it would help with your memory." Bertram finished, his expression understanding. "Of course, my dear fellow, quite natural. This place has been your life's work after all." Hugh moved slowly through the narrow aisles, running his fingers along the spines of books that felt familiar and foreign at once. The organization was logical. Fiction alphabetical by author, nonfiction by subject. Rare books in a climate-controlled case near the back. But the specific titles, the individual volumes, remained stubbornly unfamiliar. You were particularly excited about an acquisition you'd made just before the accident, Bertram said, watching Hugh's face carefully. A first edition of Poe's Tales of the Grotesque in arabesque. He'd been looking for a copy for years, you said. It's in the safe if you'd like to see it. Hugh nodded, and Bertram led him to a small office behind the main shop. The safe was hidden behind a painting of a Mississippi riverboat, and Bertram opened it with a combination he seemed to know by heart. Inside, wrapped in acid-free tissue, was a slim volume bound in dark green cloth. Even before Bertram unwrapped it completely, Hugh felt a stirring of recognition, not of the specific book, but of the hunt that had led to its acquisition, the satisfaction of finally locating a volume that had eluded him for years. You paid quite handsomely for it, Bertram said, handling the book with the reverence it deserved. The dealer in Jackson was reluctant to part with it, but you convinced him that it would be properly cared for here. Jackson. The word struck you like a physical blow. Caroline had said he was returning from Jackson when the accident occurred, but according to Bertram, he had gone there to acquire this book, a transaction he could vaguely remember contemplating, but not completing. When exactly did I purchase this? You asked. Bertram consulted a ledger on the desk. Let me see. Yes, here it is. You departed for Jackson on a Tuesday morning, completed the transaction that afternoon, and were driving back when the accident occurred that same evening. Hugh stared at the book, trying to reconcile Bertram's account with Carolyn's. She had spoken of the journey to Jackson as if it were routine, a business trip among many. But Bertram's description suggested something more significant, a culmination of years of searching, a prize finally won. Bertram, you said carefully, how long have you known me? Oh, 15 years now. Ever since you opened the shop, I was your first employee. You know, you said you needed someone who understood books not just as commodities, but as, or what was the phrase you used? Yes, as repositories of human longing. And in all that time, what have I told you about my personal life, my family? Bertram's expression grew thoughtful, as if he were sorting through years of conversations. You were always quite private about such matters, Mr. Finkton. I knew you were married, of course, and that you had children, but you rarely spoke of them in detail. I always assumed you preferred to keep your business and domestic lives separate. When did I marry Carolyn? Oh, that would have been, let me think, 12 years ago. Yes, I remember, because you took an unusually long honeymoon, 2 weeks in England, visiting antiquarian bookshops. You came back with some marvelous acquisitions and a new appreciation for medieval manuscripts. The timeline matched what Caroline had told him, but something in Bertram's tone suggested a certain detachment from these personal details, as if he were recounting information he had learned secondhand rather than witnessed firsthand. Did you attend the wedding? Hugh asked, Bertram paused, his hand still resting on the volume. You know, I don't believe I did. You said it was to be a small affair, family only. I was quite understanding. Of course, not everyone wishes to mix their professional and personal circles. And the children, have you met them? Briefly, on a few occasions, when Mrs. Finkton brought them to the shop. Charming youngsters, though I must confess, I'm not particularly comfortable around children. You seem devoted to them, of course. Hugh felt a growing unease as Bertram's answers revealed the curious isolation between his professional and personal lives. In his recovered memories of the bookshop, he had always been alone. No family photographs on his desk. No personal calls interrupting his work. No domestic concerns intruding on his bibliophilic pursuits. Could 15 years of marriage and fatherhood really leave so little trace in the place where he spent most of his waking hours? Is there somewhere I can sit and think? You asked. Somewhere quiet. Of course, my dear fellow. Your office upstairs is exactly as you left it. I haven't touched a thing. Bertram led him to a narrow staircase you hadn't noticed before, tucked behind a section of philosophy texts. The steps creaked familiarly under his feet, and Hugh found himself remembering the particular rhythm required to avoid the squeakiest boards. The office above was small and cramped, with a single window overlooking the alley behind the shop, but it felt more like home than anything on Commerce Street had. The desk was an old oak piece scarred by years of use, and the walls were lined with books that showed the signs of frequent handling. This was a working space, a place where serious thought occurred. Hugh settled into the chair behind the desk and was immediately struck by how perfectly it accommodated his body. The height was exactly right, the angle of the back perfectly suited to his posture. He had sat in this chair countless times, had made it conformed to his needs through years of use. On the desk was a leather-bound journal, the sort used for business records and correspondence notes. Hugh opened it and found entries in his own handwriting dating back several months. Most were routine records of acquisitions, notes about customers, reminders about catalog deadlines. But as he read more carefully, Hugh noticed something odd about the personal references scattered throughout the entries. March 15th. Acquired lovely first edition. Dickens from estate sale. Must remember C's birthday next week. She mentioned wanting garden tools. April 2nd. Christopher asking about trip to Memphis Book Fair told him maybe next year when he's older. May 10th. Edmund's preschool graduation tomorrow. Caroline insists I attend. Such things always make me uncomfortable. The entries referring to his family had a different quality from the rest. Stilted, formal, as if he were reminding himself about obligations rather than recording cherished moments. There was no warmth in these references, no indication of emotional attachment. If anything, they read like the notes of someone trying to remember the details of a role he was required to play. Hugh flipped to more recent entries, looking for some record of the trip to Jackson that had ended in his accident. August 20th, dealer in Jackson finally agreed to terms for the Poe, leaving Tuesday morning. This acquisition represents years of searching. Will be good to have it settled at last. August 21st. Jackson successful. Amazing condition on the Poe. Binding intact. All pages present. No foxing. Worth every penny of asking price. Driving back this evening. Looking forward to cataloging properly. There the entries ended. Hugh stared at the final notation, searching for some clue about what had happened next. But there was nothing beyond his professional satisfaction with the acquisition and his intention to return home that evening. He closed the journal and leaned back in the chair, trying to process what he had learned. According to every source, Caroline, the children, Dr. Patton, even Bertram, he was a married man with a family he loved. But his own private writing suggested someone going through the motions of domestic life without any genuine emotional investment. It was as if two different men shared the same body. The Hugh Farrington who loved rare books and cherished his solitude, and the Hugh Finkton who had somehow acquired a wife and children he felt obligated to care for, but didn't particularly enjoy. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Mr. Farrington," Bertram's voice called. "I'm sorry to disturb you, but there's someone here to see you." Hugh made his way downstairs to find Caroline standing near the front counter, her face tight with worry and what might have been anger. "Hugh, thank God," she said, moving toward him with quick steps. "When I found the guest room empty, I was terrified. You're not supposed to be walking around on your own so soon after." "I'm fine," Hugh said, though he noticed that Bertram had retreated diplomatically to the back of the shop. "I needed to see the bookshop. You could have asked me to drive you, or at least left a note. I was imagining all sorts of horrible scenarios." There was something in Caroline's tone that went beyond wheelie concern. It sounded almost possessive, as if his unauthorized absence had been a kind of betrayal. "I'm sorry," you said. "I didn't think you'd worry. I just walked a few blocks. In your condition, with broken ribs and a head injury. Hugh, you're not thinking clearly. That's exactly why you need supervision." Supervision. The word hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that made Hugh's skin crawl. He was not a child or an invalid, requiring constant oversight. He was a grown man who had managed his own affairs for decades. "I think I'm capable of deciding whether I'm well enough for a short walk," Hugh said, his voice cooler than he had intended. Caroline's expression shifted, hurt replacing irritation. "Of course you are. I didn't mean to sound. I'm just worried about you. We all are." The children were asking where Daddy had gone when they woke up. The guilt was expertly applied, but Hugh found himself resistant to it. If these were indeed his children, wouldn't he feel some natural concern for their distress? Instead, he felt only the same detached sympathy he might feel for any children facing uncertainty. "I'll be more considerate in the future," Hugh said, though the promise felt hollow even as he made it. The drive back to Commerce Street was conducted in uncomfortable silence. Caroline seemed to be struggling with emotions she didn't want to express, while Hugh found himself studying the familiar streets with new eyes. This was supposedly his neighborhood, his community, but it felt no more like home than any other collection of houses and trees. The children were waiting on the front porch when they arrived, their relief at seeing him both touching and inexplicable. If he truly was their father, their concern was natural. But if he wasn't, you got lost, Penelope said as he approached the house. I went to see my bookshop, you explained, to remember some things. Did it work? Christopher asked, his serious gray eyes searching Hugh's face. Not exactly, he admitted. That afternoon, while Caroline busied herself with household tasks that seemed designed to keep her within sight of wherever Hugh happened to be, he found himself drawn back to his study. The photographs hidden in the desk drawer continued to trouble him, not their existence, but their apparent authenticity. The man in those pictures genuinely seemed to love the people around him. Yet, Hugh could summon no echo of those feelings. He was examining the wedding photo more closely when he noticed something that made his breath catch. In the background, barely visible behind the happy couple, was a figure he recognized. Bertram standing with a small group of what appeared to be other wedding guests. But Bertram had distinctly told him that morning that he hadn't attended the wedding, that it had been family only. Either Bertram had lied, or his memory was as unreliable as everyone claimed Hugh's was. But why would Bertram lie about such a thing? What possible motivation could he have for denying his presence at his employer's wedding? Hugh studied the photo more carefully, looking for other details that might contradict the story he had been told. The setting appeared to be a church, though he couldn't identify which one. Caroline's dress was elegant but simple, suggesting either modest means or modest tastes. His own expression was one of happiness, but now that he looked more closely, there was something performative about it, as if he were conscious of being photographed and determined to appear appropriately joyful. The more he stared at the image, the more it seemed like a tableau arranged for public consumption rather than a candid moment of private joy. Even Caroline's smile, genuine though it appeared, had a quality of satisfaction that struck Hugh as oddly triumphant, as if she had achieved something significant rather than simply marrying the man she loved. A soft scratching at the study door announced the arrival of Mr. Whiskers, who entered with the confident air of a creature who knew he was welcome everywhere. The cat leaped onto Hugh's lap and began purring, a sound that vibrated through Hugh's injured ribs, but was nonetheless oddly comforting. "At least you seem to remember me," Hugh murmured, stroking the cat's orange and white fur. Mr. Whiskers purred louder, kneading Hugh's thigh with sharp claws that penetrated even the fabric of his trousers. There was something almost desperate in the cat's affection, as if it had been starved for his attention during his absence. "How long have I been gone, really?" he asked the cat, who naturally provided no answer beyond continued purring. The question hung in the air, unanswered, but increasingly urgent. According to Caroline and Dr. Peton, he had been unconscious for 3 days following the accident. But what if that wasn't true? What if he had been missing for longer, weeks, months, even years? What if the life he remembered, the solitary existence above the bookshop, was not his past, but his recent reality. And everything else was an elaborate construction designed to convince him otherwise. The possibility was so unsettling that Hugh found himself examining it despite its apparent absurdity. But if it were true, it would explain so much. His complete lack of emotional connection to his supposed family, the strange quality of his private writings about them, the way every supposed memory of domestic life remained stubbornly absent despite the overwhelming evidence of its existence. That evening, dinner passed in a careful orchestration of normally. Carolyn had prepared what she claimed was another of his favorite meals, beef stew with cornbread, and the children chatted about their day at school with the forced cheer of actors playing happy children in a domestic drama. Hugh participated as best he could, but he felt increasingly like an imposter in his own life. After the children were in bed, Caroline joined him in the living room with 2 glasses of wine and the obvious intention of having a serious conversation. "Hugh," she began, settling under the sofa beside him, "I know this is difficult for you. I can't imagine what it must be like to look at your own family and feel nothing, but I want you to know that we're going to get through this together. What if my memory doesn't return?" You asked. "What if this is permanent?" Caroline took a sip of wine before answering, as if buying time to choose her words carefully. "Then we'll build new memories. We'll fall in love again, if necessary. The important thing is that you're alive, that you're here with us." There was something in her tone that struck Hugh as rehearsed, as if she had practiced the speech. The sentiment was touching, but it felt calculated in a way that genuine emotion rarely did. "Carolyn," Hugh said carefully, "may I ask you something that might sound strange? Of course, before the accident, was I happy in our marriage? With our life together." Caroline's wine glass paused halfway to her lips. "What do you mean? Did I seem content? Fulfilled? Did I talk about feeling trapped or wanting things to be different?" "Hugh, why would you ask such a thing?" "Because I found some things in my study, my journal from the bookshop. The way I wrote about our family, it didn't sound like a man who was particularly happy with his domestic situation." Caroline set down her wine glass with a sharp clink against the coffee table. "You were always a private person, Hugh. You didn't wear your emotions on your sleeve. But yes, you were happy. We were happy. Ask anyone who knew us." "I did ask someone. I asked Bertram about our wedding, and he said he didn't attend, but I found a photograph that clearly shows him there." Carolyn's face went through a series of subtle transformations: surprise, confusion, and something that might have been calculation. "Bertram is getting older, Hugh. Perhaps his memory isn't as reliable as it once was. Or perhaps someone is lying to me." The words hung between them like an accusation. Caroline's eyes, those green eyes that had seemed so kind in the hospital, now held something harder, more dangerous. "Who would lie to you and why?" "I don't know," Hugh admitted, "but something is wrong here. I can feel it." Caroline reached for his hand, her grip firm and oddly cold. "Hugh, you're paranoid. It's a common side effect of head injuries. Dr. Peton warned me this might happen. You're looking for conspiracies where none exist. Then explain the note, you said. What? No. Hugh hadn't intended to mention the warning he'd found under his hospital pillow, but the words escaped before he could stop them. Caroline's reaction, a subtle tightening around her eyes, a barely perceptible pause, convinced him that she knew exactly what he was talking about. Someone left me a note in the hospital. Hugh continued, watching her face carefully. It warned me not to trust you. All of you. That's a Carolyn seemed to struggle for words. That's impossible. Who would do such a thing? And how would they get into your room? I was hoping you might tell me. Carolyn stood abruptly, her wine glass forgotten. Hugh, you're frightening me. As paranoia, these accusations, it's not like you. You're not well. Perhaps we should call Dr. Peton. Perhaps we should. You agreed. I'd like to ask him some questions about my case, about how long I was really unconscious, about whether anyone else has been asking questions about my condition. Something flickered across Caroline's face. Fear, anger, or perhaps calculation. I think you should rest, she said firmly. You've had too much excitement today. Your first day home should have been peaceful. But instead, you went wandering off on your own, dredging up unnecessary worries. Carolyn, his voice was quiet but firm. I want to see my apartment. What apartment? The apartment above the bookshop where I lived before we were married. I want to see if it's still there. Hugh, that apartment was sold years ago. You moved out when we married, remember? Or rather, when your memory returns, you'll remember. But Hugh was already shaking his head. I don't think that's true. I think I still live there. I think that's where I was living right up until the accident. Caroline's composure finally cracked. That's ridiculous. Hugh, look around you. Look at this house. At our children. At the life we've built together. How can you doubt what's right in front of your eyes? Because none of it feels real. Hugh said quietly, because when I look at you at them, I feel nothing. No love, no recognition, no sense of belonging. But when I went to the bookshop this morning, when I sat in my office upstairs, everything felt right. Everything felt like home. You have a head injury, Caroline said, her voice rising slightly. Your perceptions are damaged. You can't trust what you feel right now. Then I'll have to trust what I can verify, you said, standing to face her. Tomorrow, I'm going back to the bookshop. I'm going to examine that apartment above it, and I'm going to find out what really happened to me. Caroline stared at him for a long moment, her green eyes reflecting emotions he couldn't identify. When she spoke again, her voice was carefully controlled. If that's what you need to do to put your mind at ease, then of course you should do it. But when you find that the apartment is empty, when you realize that your suspicions are just the product of a damaged mind, I hope you'll be willing to accept help. Real help. She left the room without another word, her footsteps sharp against the hardwood floors. Hugh remained in the living room, staring at the family photographs that line the mantelpiece, wondering if any of them were real or if they were all carefully constructed lies designed to trap him in a life that had never been his. That night, Hugh lay in the guest room bed, listening to the sounds of the house around him. He could hear Caroline moving about in what was presumably their bedroom, her footsteps occasionally crossing the floor above his head. The children's rooms were on the same floor, and he could hear the soft murmur of Carolyn checking on them, the gentle closing of doors, the settling of a household preparing for sleep. It should have been comforting, this evidence of domestic routine and parental care. Instead, it filled Hugh with a growing sense of claustrophobia, as if the walls of the house were slowly closing in around him. Sometime after midnight, he heard footsteps in the hallway outside his door. They paused directly outside his room, and Hugh held his breath, wondering if Caroline intended to enter. The doorknob turned slowly, almost silently, and Hugh closed his eyes, finding sleep through his closed lids. He sensed light from the hallway spilling into his room. Someone was standing in the doorway, watching him. The presence lingered for what felt like several minutes before the door closed again and the footsteps retreated. Hugh lay motionless until he was certain whoever had been watching was gone. Then he rose quietly and went to the window, peering out at the garden behind the house. The night was clear with enough moonlight to make out the general shapes of trees and flower beds. But something was different about the garden from what he had seen that morning. There, beneath the oak tree, where the children's swing hung, was a dark patch in the grass, rectangular and clearly defined. It looked, he thought, with a chill that had nothing to do with the night air, very much like a grave. He watched the garden for nearly an hour, but nothing moved except the occasional flutter of leaves in the breeze. Eventually, fatigue overcame his anxiety, and he returned to bed. But sleep, when it finally came, brought dreams of earth and digging, of voices calling his name from beneath the ground, of hands reaching up through dark soil to pull him down into whatever lay buried beneath the perfect domestic facade of Caroline's garden. Morning came gray and humid, with the promise of rain in the heavy air. Hugh woke with the absolute conviction that he had to escape this house, had to return to whatever reality he had been living before the accident claimed his memory. The note's warning echoed in his mind. They aren't yours. Don't let them tuck you in. Someone had risked everything to deliver that message, and Hugh was beginning to understand why. He dressed quietly and slipped out of the guest room before the rest of the household was awake. In the kitchen, he found Caroline's purse hanging on a hook by the back door. Inside, among the usual domestic detritus, was a set of keys that included several he didn't recognize, but one that looked familiar, the key to the bookshop. Hugh pocketed the key and slipped out the back door, crossing the garden where he had seen the suspicious patch of earth the night before. In daylight, it was less ominous, simply a section where the grass grew differently, perhaps marking an old flower bed or the site of a removed tree. But he made a mental note to examine it more closely if he ever returned to this house. The walk to the bookshop was longer than he remembered, and his ribs ached with each step. But the pain felt clean, honest, unlike the psychological discomfort that had plagued him since awakening in the hospital. Bertram had not yet arrived when Hugh reached the shop, which was perfect for his purposes. The key worked smoothly in the lock, and Hugh felt a surge of rightness as he entered the familiar space. This was his domain, his sanctuary, the one place in Natchez that felt authentically his own. He made his way directly to the staircase, behind the philosophy section, and climbed to his office. But this time, instead of stopping there, he continued up a second narrower staircase that led to what Bertram had called the apartment above the shop. The door at the top of the stairs was locked, but Hugh's key ring included what appeared to be the right key. His heart pounded as he turned it in the lock, not knowing what he might find beyond. The door opened to reveal small but comfortable living space that was unmistakably occupied and obviously his own. A narrow bed with rumpled sheets, a kitchenette with coffee cups in the sink, clothes hanging in a closet that recognized his taste and size. Books everywhere, of course, but not the valuable volumes from the shop below. These were reading copies, personal favorites, books that showed the wear of frequent handling. Hugh moved through the space like a sleepwalker, touching objects that felt familiar beneath his fingers. Here was his favorite coffee mug, chipped but cherished. Here were his reading glasses placed beside a book that lay open to a page he remembered reaching the night before his departure for Jackson. Here was evidence of the life he actually remembered living: solitary, scholarly, content in its simplicity. In the bedroom, he found a dresser whose drawers contained his clothes, his personal effects, his private papers. Among these was a lease agreement dated only 6 months earlier, proving that far from being sold years ago, this apartment was his current legal residence. But the most significant discovery was a shoebox hidden beneath the bed, containing documents that made Hugh's blood run cold. Inside were legal papers, a marriage certificate, birth certificates for 3 children, insurance policies, bank statements, all bearing his name and signature, all apparently authentic. But the dates were wrong. According to these documents, his marriage to Caroline had taken place not 12 years ago, but only 6 months previously. The birth certificates for the children were even more recent, some dated as little as 3 months in the past. Hugh sank onto the bed, his mind reeling. If these documents were authentic, then everything Caroline had told him was a lie. Their marriage, their children, their years of domestic happiness, all of it was fiction, an elaborate deception constructed in the mere months before his accident. But why? What could possibly motivate someone to create such an intricate false reality? And how had it been done? How do you produce children who not only exist, but who seem to have genuine memories of a father they could not possibly have known for more than a few months? A sound from downstairs interrupted his thoughts. The shop door opening, footsteps on the wooden floor. Bertram arriving for work, most likely. But Hugh found himself suddenly paranoid about being discovered here. He replaced the documents in their hiding place and made his way quietly to the window that overlooked the alley behind the shop. The window opened easily, and Hugh saw that a fire escape provided access to the ground level. He could leave without encountering whoever had entered the shop below. But as he prepared to climb out onto the metal platform, he heard voices from the shop. Not just Bertram's familiar tones, but Caroline's voice as well, sharp with what sounded like anger or fear. Hugh pressed himself against the wall beside the window, straining to hear their conversation through the old building's floors and walls. Told you he was asking questions. Caroline's voice partially obscured by distance and intervening structure. Didn't think he would remember. Bertram's reply clearer because of his deeper voice. The apartment. If he finds, I should have been more careful. The documents too late now have to. The conversation continued, but Hugh could make out only fragments. What he could hear was enough to confirm his worst suspicions. Bertram and Caroline were conspirators in whatever deception had trapped him. The kindly old bookseller, who had seemed like his only genuine connection to his real life, was as false as everything else. Hill climbed carefully onto the fire escape, wincing as his injured ribs protested the movement. The metal structure was old but solid, and he made his way down to the alley without incident. But where could he go now? Caroline would be looking for him, and apparently Bertram was part of whatever conspiracy surrounded him. The entire town of Natchez suddenly felt like hostile territory. He walked aimlessly through the historic district, trying to process what he had discovered. The documents in his apartment proved that his marriage to Caroline was recent, not the 12-year relationship she claimed. But the children remained a mystery. How do you create 3 children with distinct personalities, complete with memories and mannerisms that suggested years of development? Were they actors, victims of some other deception, or was there an explanation even more sinister than Hugh dared to contemplate? The morning had grown warmer, and Hugh's ribs ached from his activities. He found himself on a bench overlooking the Mississippi River, watching the muddy water flow past with the same indifferent persistence it had maintained for millennia. The river had witnessed countless human dramas, countless deceptions and revelations, and it would continue to flow long after Hugh's current crisis was resolved one way or another. It was there, sitting by the river, that the final piece of the puzzle came to him. Not in a flash of revelation, but as a slow, creeping certainty that made his skin crawl with its implications. The children were real. They existed. They had memories. They genuinely seemed to care for the man they called Daddy. But they weren't his children. They belonged to someone else. The real Hugh Farrington, the man whose life had been stolen and given to an imposter. Hugh rose from the bench with movements that felt mechanical, robotic. If his theory was correct, then somewhere in Natchez was a man who looked like him, sounded like him, perhaps even shared his memories in some impossible way. And that man, the real Hugh Farrington, was missing his family, wondering where his children were, searching for the life that had been taken from him. The question was, where would such a man be? Where would you hide someone whose existence contradicted the elaborate deception you had constructed? The answer came to him with horrifying clarity. You would put him exactly where everyone expected him to be, in plain sight, but in a place where his protests would be dismissed as the ravings of a madman or the confusion of a brain-injured patient. He would put him in a hospital, but not the hospital where Hugh had awakened. That would be too obvious, too easy to discover. He would use a different facility, somewhere his claims about his identity would be treated as delusions rather than facts. Hugh began walking with purpose, now heading toward the older section of Natchez, where the state mental hospital had operated for over a century. If his theory was correct, if there really was another Hugh Finkton somewhere in the system, that's where he would be found. The Natchez State Hospital was a sprawling complex of brick buildings that spoke of decades of institutional care and institutional neglect. Hugh had driven past it countless times, but had never had reason to visit. Now, standing before its imposing gates, he felt the weight of possibility and dread in equal measure. Getting inside would be difficult without proper authorization, but Hugh had one advantage. He was, according to all official records, a recent patient himself. Hospital staff might be sympathetic to someone who claimed to be visiting a fellow patient, especially someone who showed obvious signs of recent medical treatment. The main entrance was monitored by security, but Hugh noticed that staff members were entering through a side door using key cards. He positioned himself near this entrance and waited for an opportunity. It came when a young woman in scrubs approached the door while juggling a coffee cup and an armload of files. Hugh stepped forward with a helpful smile. "Let me get that door for you," he said, reaching for the handle as she swiped her card. "Oh, thank you," she said gratefully, allowing him to hold the door as she maneuvered her burden through the opening. Hugh followed her inside, moving with the confident stride of someone who belonged. The interior of the hospital was institutional in the way of all such facilities. Fluorescent lighting, linoleum floors, the smell of disinfectant barely masking more organic odors. Finding the right patient would be challenging, but Hugh had an advantage. He knew exactly what he was looking for. Somewhere in this facility was a man who looked like him, who claimed to be Hugh Finkton of Commerce Street, who insisted that his wife and children had been stolen from him. The psychiatric ward was on the 3rd floor. According to the directory in the main lobby, Hugh took the elevator up, his heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and fear. If he was wrong about this, if there was no other Hugh of Farrington, then he truly was suffering from delusions brought on by his head injury. But if he was right, the 3rd floor was quieter than the rest of the hospital with a different quality of sound. Muffled conversations, distant crying, the soft shuffling of medicated footsteps. Hugh approached the nurse's station with as much confidence as he could muster. "I'm looking for a patient," he told the nurse on duty, a tired-looking woman with graying hair. Hugh Farrington. He was admitted recently, possibly under unusual circumstances. The nurse consulted her computer, frowning slightly. "Are you family?" In a manner of speaking, Hugh said, which was true enough. "Room 312, the nurse said, "but he's been quite agitated lately. Claims people have stolen his identity, kidnapped his family. Sad case. Complete break with reality following some kind of trauma. Room 312, was at the end of a long corridor lined with similar doors. Through the small window in each, Hugh could glimpse the residents of this floor. Some sleeping, some staring at television screens, some engaged in conversations with invisible companions. But the man in room 312 was none of these things. He was sitting on the edge of his bed, staring at the wall with an expression of profound loss that Hugh recognized because he had seen it in his own mirror. The man looked exactly like Hugh Farrington. Not similar, not reminiscent. Exactly the same down to the small scar on his chin from a childhood accident. Hugh distinctly remembered having the same gray eyes, the same slightly crooked nose, the same pattern of lines around the eyes that came from years of squinting at small print in old books. Hugh stood in the doorway, staring at his own face, his own body, his own self sitting lost and broken in a psychiatric hospital room. The other Hugh looked up, and their eyes met across the small space. For a moment, neither moved. Then the other Hugh rose slowly, his expression cycling through disbelief, hope, and something that might have been recognition. "You," he said quietly. "You're me." "Yes," Hugh replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Then you know," the other Hugh said. "You know what they've done." Hugh stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. "Tell me," he said. "The other Hugh, the real Hugh." Hugh realized with growing certainty, sat back down heavily on the bed. His movements were those of a man who had been broken by circumstances beyond his comprehension. "They took everything." "Real," Hugh said, his voice hollow. "My wife, my children, my life. One day I woke up here and they told me I was delusional, that I was imagining a family that didn't exist. But I know what's real. I know what I've lost. Caroline, you said Christopher, Penelope, Edmund." The real Hugh's eyes filled with tears. "You've seen them. You've been with them. Are they all right? Are they safe?" Hugh felt a crushing weight settle on his chest. This man, this broken mirror image of himself, genuinely loved the family that Hugh had felt nothing for. The children who had seemed like strangers to Hugh were this man's beloved offspring, and he had been torn away from them by forces neither of them yet understood. "They're safe," Hugh said gently, "but they don't remember you. They think I'm their father." "Of course they do," the real you said bitterly. "That's how it works. That's how she makes it work. She Caroline, though I don't think that's her real name. Nothing about her is real. Nothing about any of this is real." Hugh sat in the room's single chair, studying this man who shared his face, but carried wounds that Hugh couldn't remember receiving. "How long have you been here?" 3 months, they tell me, though time moves strangely in this place. Sometimes it feels like years, sometimes like days. They give me medications that make everything fuzzy, make it hard to think clearly. But I remember being happy. "Tell me about your life," Hugh said. "Your real life." The real Hugh's expression softened as he spoke of mornings with his children, of helping Christopher with his homework, of Penelope's recorder recital, of Edmund's endless questions about everything. He described a marriage that had grown deeper over 12 years, a house that was truly a home, quiet Sunday mornings, reading, while Caroline garden-arted. We were ordinary, he said. Wonderfully, perfectly ordinary. I had my bookshop. Caroline had her painting. She's quite talented, you know. And the children had their small dramas and triumphs. It wasn't exciting, but it was ours. What's the last thing you remember before ending up here? I was driving back from Jackson. I'd found a first edition Poe that I'd been searching for. I was thinking about how pleased Caroline would be. She understood what books meant to me, even if she didn't share the obsession. And then nothing. I woke up here and they told me I was Hugh Farrington, but that everything I remembered was a fantasy. Hugh felt the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with horrifying clarity. The accident, he said. There really was an accident. Yes, but not the kind they told you about. I think someone arranged it. Someone who needed both of us out of the way temporarily. Both of us. The real Hugh looked directly at him with eyes that held a terrible knowledge. You're not just someone who looks like me. You are me. You're Hugh Farrington just as much as I am. We're the same person. Somehow split, copied, duplicated. The words should have sounded insane. But Hugh found himself accepting them with the calm that comes when impossible things suddenly make perfect sense. It explained everything. Why he remembered the bookshop, but not the family. Why the family felt like strangers despite overwhelming evidence of their relationship. Why there had been 2 sets of documents in his apartment. How is that possible? I don't know. The real you admitted, but I know it's true. I can see it in your face. You remember the bookshop, the apartment above it, the life of a solitary man. But you don't remember Caroline or the children because you never lived with them. You're the part of me that was left behind, the part that didn't get to have that happiness. Hugh thought about this, about the implications of being only a fragment of a person, a shadow cast by someone else's life. It should have been devastating, but instead, he felt an odd sense of relief. It explained why he had felt so disconnected from everything. Why love for his supposed family had been impossible to summon. What does Caroline want? He asked. What's the purpose of all this? I think the real Hugh said slowly. She wants to keep what she's taken. The house. The children. The life we built together. But she needed me out of the way to do it. And she needed someone to take my place who wouldn't ask too many questions. But I am asking questions. Yes. And that's what she didn't expect. She thought your memories would return gradually, that you'd slip back into the role without realizing what had been done. But you're not me. Not really. You're the part of me that lived alone, that was comfortable with solitude. You don't have the capacity to love them the way they need to be loved. Hugh considered this. The note in the hospital. Was that from you? No. I've been locked up here since before your accident. But there must be someone else who knows what's happening. Someone who's trying to help. Bertram. Maybe. Though I overheard him talking to Caroline this morning. Bertram. The real Hugh's face grew troubled. I trusted him completely. If he's part of this, maybe he's being coerced. Maybe they have something on him. A sound in the corridor outside made both men freeze. Footsteps coming closer, accompanied by voices Hugh recognized with a chill of fear. Room 312. Caroline's voice sharp with anxiety. He has to be here. Where else would he go? Mrs. Farrington. A man's voice. Probably a doctor. I must insist that you not agitate the patient. He's made remarkable progress recently, and we don't want to trigger another episode. You don't understand, Caroline said. The man you think is my husband. He's not. He's somehow connected to your patient here. And if they meet, the door handle turned, and Hugh realized he had nowhere to hide in the small room. He looked at the real Hugh, who had gone pale, but whose eyes held a desperate determination. Whatever happened, the real Hugh whispered, "Remember that they're my children. Remember that I love them." The door opened and Caroline stepped inside, followed by a middle-aged man in a white coat. She saw Hugh immediately, and her face went through a series of rapid changes. Surprise, fear, and something that might have been triumph. "There you are," she said, her voice carefully controlled. "Who, darling? You've had us so worried when you didn't come home." "Home," he repeated, looking from Caroline to the broken man on the bed. "Which one of us are you talking to?" The doctor stepped forward, his expression professionally concerned. "Sir, I'm Dr. Whitfield. I think there's been some confusion. This patient has been suffering from severe delusions, and I'm afraid your presence here might exacerbate his condition." "My presence," Hugh said, "or his?" He gestured to the real Hugh, who was staring at Caroline with an expression of such longing and pain that Hugh felt his heart contract in sympathy. "Caroline," the real Hugh whispered, "please, I know you remember. I know some part of you remembers how happy we were." Caroline's composure wavered for just a moment, and he who saw something flicker across her face. Regret, perhaps, or the ghost of genuine affection. But it was gone almost immediately, replaced by the careful mask she had worn since Hugh's awakening in the hospital. "I'm sorry," she said to the real you, her voice gentle but firm. "I don't know what you think you remember, but I've never seen you before in my life. My husband is right here." She moved to Hugh's side, taking his arm in a gesture that felt more possessive than affectionate. "Your husband," Hugh said, pulling away from her grip, "is sitting on that bed, and you know it." Dr. Whitfield cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation in my office. This is clearly a complex situation that requires careful handling." But Hugh was no longer interested in careful handling or professional mediation. The sight of the real Hugh's anguish, the obvious love he felt for a family that had been stolen from him, filled Hugh with a rage he hadn't known he was capable of feeling. "How did you do it?" he demanded, turning to face Caroline. "How did you split us? How did you create two people from one?" "Who? You're not making sense," Caroline said, but there was panic beneath her calm exterior. "Now you're confused, disoriented. We need to get you back to Dr. Peton, get you proper care. I found the documents. You said in my apartment above the bookshop. The apartment you claimed was sold years ago. Marriage certificate dated 6 months ago. Birth certificates for the children that are even more recent. Everything you told me was a lie." The real you looked up sharply. "The children's birth certificates are recent. Very recent, some of them only a few months old. Understanding dawned in the real Hugh's eyes, followed by horror, so profound that you felt it like a physical blow. They're not birth certificates. The real, Hugh said slowly. They're adoption papers. She didn't steal my children. She stole me, and then she stole children to replace the ones I remember. The room fell silent except for the institutional hum of fluorescent lights and distant hospital sounds. Caroline's face had gone pale, and Dr. Whitfield was looking between the two men with growing alarm. "That's impossible," Caroline said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Is it?" Hugh asked. "Is it any more impossible than creating two identical men from one? Is it any more impossible than making a whole town believe that I've been married for 12 years when I've been living alone above my bookshop? The children," the real Hugh said, his voice breaking. "My real children. What happened to my real children?" Carolyn's silence was answer enough. Hugh felt a cold certainty settle in his stomach as he realized the full scope of what had been done. Not just identity theft, but something far more sinister. The complete erasure of a family. The replacement of real people with carefully chosen substitutes. "Where are they?" Hugh demanded. "Where are his real wife and children?" "I don't know what you're talking about," Carolyn said, but she was backing toward the door now, her composure finally cracking completely. Dr. Whitfield stepped forward, clearly out of his depth, but trying to maintain some semblance of professional control. "I think we need to involve hospital security. This situation is becoming potentially dangerous." But Hugh was already moving not toward Caroline, but toward the real Hugh who had risen from the bed with sudden purpose. "We have to find them," the real Hugh said. "If the children I've been living with are substitutes, then my real family is somewhere else. Somewhere she's hidden them, or somewhere they've been." Hugh couldn't finish the thought, couldn't voice the possibility that was growing stronger in his mind. Carolyn had reached the door now, but instead of fleeing, she turned back. Something had changed in her face. The careful mask of whiffly concern had slipped away entirely, revealing the exhausted desperation of someone who had been carrying an unbearable secret. "You want to know the truth?" she said, her voice breaking slightly. "Fine, but you won't like it." She stepped back into the room, and Dr. Whitfield started to protest, but something in her manner made him fall silent. Hugh noticed her hands were trembling, not with fear, but with the kind of fatigue that comes from months of impossible strain. "I was a neurobiologist," Caroline said quietly, "at the university, before everything fell apart. I specialized in memory mapping, consciousness transfer, theoretical work mostly, the kind of research that gets you laughed out of conferences." Hugh felt something cold settle in his stomach. "What does that have to do with you?" "Everything." Caroline's laugh was bitter. Hugh Farrington was brilliant, kind, the sort of man who deserved to live longer than 37 years. When the accident happened, when I lost him, I couldn't accept it. I had his brain scans from a research study he'd participated in. Detailed maps of every neural pathway, every memory engram. The other Hugh was staring at her with growing horror. "That's impossible. You can't just recreate a person from brain scans. Not perfectly, no. But you can create approximations, fragments. The technology exists. Experimental, dangerous, completely illegal. I knew people who had access to the right equipment, people who owed me favors. Dr. Whitfield found his voice. You're talking about cloning. Human cloning is not cloning. Something worse. Caroline wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I grew 2 bodies using Hugh's genetic material. Rapid aging accelerated development. Then I uploaded fragments of his consciousness, different pieces, different aspects of his personality. One got his love of solitude, his scholarly nature. The other got his capacity for family, for domestic happiness. Hugh felt the world tilting around him. We were copies, failed copies, incomplete ones. The process is imperfect. That's why you have gaps. Why? Nothing feels quite right. You're not him. You're shadows of him pieced together from neural fragments and wishful thinking. Carolyn's voice broke slightly. Bertram helped me at first. He loved you too. Couldn't bear to see everything end. But when he realized what I was really doing, what you really were, he tried to stop me. The note in the hospital was his doing. A desperate attempt to warn you before it was too late. But the memories, the other Hugh whispered. I remember my children being born. I remember falling in love with you, implanted, constructed from his brain scans and my own desperate fantasies about the life we might have had. I gave you false memories to try to make you whole, to make you happy. Caroline's voice cracked. I thought if I could just perfect the process, if I could make you believe you were real. The children, you said they're real orphans. I volunteer at the children's home. That's how I met them. They needed a family. And I thought I could give them the father they deserved, even if he wasn't quite real. Hugh looked at his hands, flesh and blood certainly, but grown in some laboratory animated by stolen memories and artificial neural patterns. Everything he thought he was had been constructed by a grieving woman who couldn't let go. How long do we have? He asked quietly. Caroline's face crumpled. The neural patterns are degrading. The implanted memories are breaking down, fragmenting. I estimate maybe weeks, possibly days. That's why you're starting to remember things that don't fit. Why you're questioning everything. The artificial consciousness is failing. The other you was weeping now, silent tears streaming down a face that looked exactly like Hugh's own. I love them so much, he whispered. Even if it's artificial, even if it's not real, I love those children. I know. Caroline said that's the cruelest part. The love is real, even if everything else is constructed. Your capacity to feel, to care, that came from him. That was the one thing I managed to preserve perfectly. Hugh felt a strange sense of peace settling over him. The mystery was solved, the questions answered. He wasn't Hugh Finkton, but he carried pieces of that man's heart, his capacity for love and wonder. That had to count for something. What happens to the children when we're gone? He asked. They'll be adopted properly by people who can give them real lives, not fantasies built on grief and impossible science. Caroline looked between them with profound regret. "I'm so sorry. I thought I could make it work. I thought love was enough." The other Hughes stood up slowly, his movements careful, deliberate. "Caroline, I need you to promise me something. Anything. Tell them we love them. When they're old enough to understand what happened, tell them that even though we weren't real, our love for them was. Tell them we wanted to be real for them." Caroline nodded, unable to speak. Hugh felt the artificial neural patterns beginning to destabilize, memories fragmenting like old film burning. But the love remained clear, bright, untouchable. Perhaps that was the only real thing about him. His capacity to care for 3 children who had needed a father, even a temporary one. "Take care of them," he said to Carolyn. "All of them. Give them the life we couldn't." The degradation was accelerating now, consciousness unraveling like a badly knitted sweater. But you found he wasn't afraid. He had existed, however briefly, however artificially. He had loved and been loved in return for a creation of science and grief. Perhaps that was enough. Dr. Whitfield stood frozen, watching something unprecedented unfold before him. 2 men who weren't quite men, saying goodbye to a life they'd never quite lived. Caroline watched through her tears as the neural patterns finally collapsed as 2 impossible consciousnesses released their hold on existence and faded into whatever silence waits for artificial dreams when they finally end. The room fell quiet. Outside, the Mississippi River continued its ancient flow, carrying away the remnants of one story while preparing to witness countless others. In the distance, a bookshop stood empty waiting. And that brings us to the end of another night filled with tales from the shadows. To anyone who stuck with me until the very end, thank you so much for sharing this journey into the unknown. Your company makes these dark stories feel a little less lonely, and I'm truly grateful you chose to spend your evening here with me. I hope these tales have given you exactly what you came for, that delicious blend of fear and fascination. There's something wonderfully eerie about how we can all gather in the darkness, connected by our love of a good scare. And I genuinely hope tonight's stories resonated with you as much as they did with me. I'll be back tomorrow night with more mysteries and chills waiting to unfold. So, I hope you'll join me again. Until then, sleep well, dream peacefully, and don't let tonight's stories follow you into your dreams. Though if they do, just remember they're only stories after all. Sweet dreams, my friend. See you tomorrow night. Heat. Heat.